Welcome back to Raised by Giants live discussion. Thanks for joining in on this lovely day, Inauguration Day, the 60th inauguration of the President of the United States, the 47th President, but the 60th inauguration. Good to see everyone in the chat, any moderators and or channel members out there. And to anyone that's listening to the replay, thanks for joining us. And if you're listening on audio only, because the show is also a podcast, so be sure to follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and Google Podcasts, and you can download the audio-only episodes on whatever podcast platform you listen to. The show drops on all of those platforms almost immediately after it's released here. Also, we are a viewer-supported show. We don't have any sponsorships, no advertising, no affiliate programs. It's just me. So if you'd like to help support the show, PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description. Also, you can send in super chats and super stickers if you would like a question or a comment to be highlighted during the show. Channel memberships are also available and are a great way to help support the show monthly. And when you become a channel member, you get access to bonus episodes for being a channel member. And there's a huge back catalog. Click the More button underneath the title of the video to the drop down of the description. All of my links, including the links to sign up to be a channel member, and my guest links are also in there as well. So with that down, we have with us today UK music journalist, club and radio DJ, author, and the star of A Clockwork Shining on Amazon Prime, Apple TV Plus, and now available worldwide on Vimeo. Links are in the description. Broadcasting live from the UK, Mark Devlin, welcome to the show.
What's up, brother? Good to link with you again.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I'm glad we could definitely make it happen. Man, I remember listening to your rants, your car rants back in the day, which were fantastic, by the way. Also, before that, you had conscious rapper Diesel Automatic on your show, Good Vibrations. Is that correct? With Joe Murray?
That's right, yeah. A couple of great rappers. Diesel is out of Montenegro in Eastern Europe, and Joe Murray's out of New York. And yeah, great conscious, freedom-orientated hip-hop. Not a lot of it around.
Yeah, and I've had Diesel on my show a couple of times, and we've become really good friends since then. So thank you for having them on. You introduced me to them. Yeah. So when was it in your music career that you realize that the entire music industry is essentially rigged?
Well, I was a slow learner. Took me a while. So I spent the best part of 20 years as a club and radio DJ. And I'm someone that's always loved music. I bought my first record when I was 5, which was Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, first time around. 7-inch single, saved up my pocket money and went and got a copy of that. And that turned me on to pop music, basically. So I grew up in the 80s, or the first part of the 80s, just listening to whatever was in the charts and whatever was on the radio. And then I kind of fine-tuned my tastes a bit in the mid-80s and got into black music. So I got into soul, funk, early hip-hop, early house music. And that set me on a path to wanting to become a DJ, because I wanted to communicate my love for this music to other people, which is the main reason why anyone becomes a DJ. And I achieved that. I got into radio first off, and then off the back of the radio, I got into doing clubs. And I worked really hard. I've always had a very strong work ethic and hustled a lot, did a lot of networking and hobnobbing with all the right people, not P. Diddy, thankfully, all the other right people. And I managed to get gigs all over the UK and then internationally. So it really became a career for me. It was a full-time job and I was loving it. I was playing R&B, hip hop, reggae, dancehall, traveling all around the world, meeting some great people, great clubs, loads of women, and life was great. And it took me until round about 2007 to start to see some of the cracks in the music industry facade. So round about that time, I'd started reading the books of David Icke, and my dad actually put me on to them because he was reading that stuff himself, and he recommended that I should approach it with an open mind. And at that point, like most people in the UK, I thought that David Icke had lost his mind, because that's the way we've been conditioned to think of him through the mainstream media. So I was like, really? This guy's crazy, isn't he? And my dad said, well, read the books and at the end of it, see if he sounds so crazy. So I did that. And I read his book about the 9/11 attacks, Alice in Wonderland of the World Trade Center disaster. And it raised a whole load of questions in my mind. And I was like, yeah, actually, he's got a point. This stuff doesn't add up. And then I read his book, The Biggest Secret, which totally blew my mind. And I emerged from that process seeing the world in a different way to what had previously been the case. Also, in 2008, I got put onto the first Zeitgeist movie.
Me too. Me too. I saw that as well. That's what basically what people say awoken me as well as
Right.
the first Zeitgeist movie. Yeah.
Yeah. So the combination of David Icke and Zeitgeist was enough for me to totally change my entire worldview. And I did it step by step, stage by stage. But first off, I was like, well, hang on a minute, because if organized society is controlled by secret society networks and they use it for mass mind control and social engineering and to keep the people in line and to enslave humanity, then they're not going to have let something like the music industry slip through the net, given the wonderful opportunities that institution offers to mass mind control large numbers of people. So I thought, well, this stuff must be present in music. So I made that my specialist area of interest. I saw a lot of people doing geopolitical analysis. A lot of people were looking at the banking, financial scams, and things of that nature. But I didn't see too many researchers looking into the music industry and the way entertainment has been weaponized through occult symbolism, through the manipulation of sound frequencies, through subliminal images placed into movies and things of that nature. You know all about that. And so I made it my specialist area of interest. And so for the past 15 years or so, it's been pretty much my full-time job. I started to wind up the DJing shortly after that because, for one thing, the music was changing for the worst, and so-called hip-hop was becoming nothing of the sort. It bore no resemblance to what had been there before. So I didn't really have much interest in continuing to play the music. And also, in all good conscience, I just decided I couldn't really be a part of this beast machine that's pushing all this harmful stuff. So I started to reel in the DJing, and I had the idea of putting out a book based on the first 5 years worth of my findings. And that ended up being Musical Truth Volume 1, which came out in early 2016. And it's been my full-time job since then. So I've been putting out a bunch of books. I do podcasts and videos. I do live talks and conferences, presentations. And it's very different to what I was doing before. But at the same time, there are lots of parallels. But what I'm doing now is a lot more satisfying, fulfilling, and probably better for the soul.
When it comes to hip hop and rap, though, too, I've gotten into an argument with some people over Tupac because I 100% believe Tupac was an actor.
Yeah.
Have you looked into Tupac at all?
I have, and I would go along with that. I mean, Tupac was literally an actor. He was trained in the performing arts. So before he became a rapper and he was down with all this thug life stuff, imagery, he studied dancing, like ballet dancing and acting in performing arts schools. And he had some film roles. He was in Juice. That was like his big movie breakthrough in 1991. He was in Poetic Justice with Janet Jackson. He did a whole bunch of movies. So it's almost like his hip hop career was kind of an afterthought to this other stuff that he was doing. But I never really bought this idea of him as this tough kind of thug guy pushing this criminal lifestyle. It just never rang true with me. It always smacked more of it being an agenda. So when it comes to his reported assassination in September 1996, I know there are some people who will claim that that was a staged event, it was a fake death, and he may well still be alive. And I can't rule that out. But the way I see it was that event was used to escalate the so-called East Coast, West Coast beef within hip hop, which occurred in the mid-90s. And this involved Puff Daddy, Sean Combs, known these days as P. Diddy. So even back in the 90s, he was up to his treacherous, scrawny, untrustworthy neck in controversy. And Bad Boy Records the label that he had in New York, and he put out artists like Notorious B.I.G. and a whole bunch of other rappers and R&B singers through that label. And then over on the West Coast in LA, you had Death Row Records, headed up by Suge Knight, with Tupac as one of the prominent rappers on that label. And the East Coast, West Coast psyop was all about whipping up discontent and fomenting discord between the two different coasts and inviting rap fans to pick a side. So who you down with? You're down with Suge Knight and Death Row, or you're down with Puffy and Bad Boy Records? And there was a high body count which emerged out of that whole thing, not least the notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, who was assassinated, gunned down in a hail of bullets almost 6 months to the day after we were told that Tupac got shot. This was in March of 97. All kinds of questions about that. One that I've got is, why did Puffy, if he was his best mate and his mentor, his handler, not travel in the same car? Quite lucky for Puffy that he traveled separately. So Biggie died in that, and also a whole bunch of other people died in this so-called beef because, you know, characters were getting involved in the turmoil that had no real interest in it, but because of the discord that had been systematically whipped up, people were getting shot. So I see the whole thing as having been a psyop, and given that Tupac's reported death pretty much kicked off the escalations, I have to ask myself whether he could indeed have been an actor, and whether that assassination event was genuine or whether it was faked and staged. Wouldn't be the first time we've seen it, nor the last.
Yeah, I think that if you want to learn more about Tupac, all you got to do is watch that high school interview of him. Just type in the YouTube high school interview of Tupac and you'll see exactly what's going on. Now, how far back does the influence from the intelligence and the military go in the music industry? Did it come from the very inception? Because I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is true, you could probably tell me if this is true, but that Elvis was in some kind of witness protection program.
Right. Well, I would say that the military intelligence infiltration of music goes all the way back to the very start. And my research takes me back to about 1955. So I go back to the mid 50s, and that was the birth of the rock and roll era. And Elvis Presley was the first rock and roll superstar. So 1 year before Elvis broke through, you had Bill Haley and his Comets with this very important record, Rock Around the Clock, which pretty much changed youth culture at the time. It used to be Bill Haley and the Comets, but these days it's his Comets. That's the Mandela effect for you. But this group was, they were knocking on a bit. You know, Bill Haley was no youngster, and he'd been involved with bluegrass and country music and stuff of this nature. And then suddenly in 1954, he put out a record called Shake, Rattle and Roll. And the following year, he broke through with Rock Around the Clock. And there was a movie titled Rock Around the Clock that came out at the same time. Also, the song was featured on the soundtrack to The Blackboard Jungle, which was another really important film from the mid-50s. And this was the same year that James Dean had his film Rebel Without a Cause. So these very influential movies were happening at the same time as music was changing. So up to that point in the mid-50s, the music scene in both Britain and America was pretty austere and conservative and rather boring, you might say. It was the post-war era. It was very traditional musical values. And then in the middle of that decade, you get effectively the birth of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You get the birth of the term teenager, which had not been used up to that point to describe young people. And you got James Dean, this iconic film god. And then the following year, with Bill Haley and the Comets having paved the way for him, Elvis Presley breaks through with Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock, Blue Suede Shoes. And he's this very sexually attractive to women, young, dynamic guy. And he's like nothing anyone's ever seen before. He's handled by a guy named Colonel Tom Parker, or he's referred to as Colonel anyway. He wasn't a real military colonel. He was a Dutchman. And there are lots of dubious gaps in his official biography to explain where he came from. So he arrived in America, and he was reportedly embroiled in an undercover operation which was known as Operation Top Hat. And this involved the testing of biological and chemical warfare, decontamination methods, we're told, and it was military personnel that were used as the human guinea pigs, as it so often is. So this biological weaponry was being tested out on the military guys themselves, and it seems that Colonel Tom Parker was one of these. During the military service that he did in the United States, he underwent a period of isolation, solitary confinement. And even his official biography acknowledges that when he came out of solitary confinement, it had given him a severe form of psychosis. You don't say. I mean, this is one of the standard methods used in MKUltra trauma-based mind control. Sensory deprivation and solitary confinement, effectively. It's known that this can cause the mind to dissociate from reality and shatter into these different compartments. So this is the guy who, when he came out of the military, was given the role of being Elvis Presley's first manager, and he stayed with him pretty much throughout his career. What we often find is that handlers have undergone mind control themselves, and then they pass it on to their subjects. So there's evidence to suggest that Elvis was mind controlled himself in the early days. This is what they do with performers of all kinds, not just singers, but all kinds of musicians and Hollywood actors, anyone that's in the public spotlight. They mind control them to make sure they stay on script and make sure they keep pushing the agendas that have been set out for them. So later in his career, it seems that Elvis developed an interest in law enforcement. So supposedly he was very patriotic and had quite traditional Christian conservative values. And he was concerned at the moral decline of American society, not least the influx of drugs coming through organized crime networks. And so the story goes that he volunteered to President Richard Nixon to become a spy, effectively. And he said, look, I've got the perfect cover. I'm this well-recognized musician that gets booked to go and perform all over the place. This puts me in an ideal position to infiltrate certain groups and gather certain information without suspicion falling on me, because I'm this famous music guy, right? And supposedly that's what Elvis embarked on. He was working for the Drug Enforcement Agency because he wanted to try and stop the influx of street drugs. He also had connections with the FBI, and he had connections with the police departments of various cities around North America. And I was watching a webinar a couple of months ago, actually, by a researcher named Ule Damagard of lightonconspiracies.com. Do you know of him?
No, I do not.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. He's a Danish guy. He lives in Bali these days, but for the past 30 years or so, he's specialized in investigating political assassinations and psyops and the cover-ups that follow in their wake. And he's done a bit of work looking into Elvis. And his conclusion in this webinar that he put out the other week was that Elvis ended up infiltrating crime gangs, including Sam Giancarlo coming out of Chicago, and also the Gambino crime family coming out of New Orleans. And so he was basically ratting on them, going back to his paymasters in the intel community and reporting on what he'd overheard and what he'd seen. And supposedly the mob got wind of the fact that there was some sort of mole within their operation. And according to Ule, initially suspicion fell on Frank Sinatra, because Frank Sinatra was all tied up with the mob, and they put a hit out on him. And due to some crossed wires and wrongful communication, Frank Sinatra's mother ended up getting taken out instead of him. So they supposedly got some information that Frank was due to be on this private jet that he traveled around in, but actually his mother had got on this private Learjet, and it crashed into a mountain in January of 1977 and killed her. Anyway, later in 1977, 16th of August, we're told, Elvis dies at the age of 42 in the bathroom of his place, Gracelands. There are conflicting stories about exactly what happened. His girlfriend at the time said that he collapsed in the bathroom. She found him unconscious in the bathroom. And this close friend and associate that was also in Gracelands at the time, part of the Memphis Mafia that Elvis used to roll with, claimed that Elvis was on the bed when he was found. So they don't seem to get their stories straight. And there are all kinds of inconsistencies when it comes to the funeral as well, because it was open casket. And the mourners at the funeral said that the body in the casket appeared to be sweating, perspiring, and it had like a false glued on sideboard that was coming off. It was peeling off. And also there was hair dye that was kind of leaking into the sweat, like this black hair dye. And it just didn't look like Elvis. And supposedly there was a sighting of somebody that looked like Elvis hiding out in the pool house at Gracelands when this reporter was taking photographs a few days afterwards. And so Ole Damagaard's conclusion is that Elvis's death was faked, and he achieved this with the assistance of his associates in the military intelligence community, because you can't fake your death otherwise. You just can't get away with it. You've got to have the complicity and the cooperation of these alphabet agencies. And so he went into deep cover, like a witness protection program, changed his name, moved away. There is a preacher who goes by the name of Pastor Bob Joyce, who people might have heard of. So you can get videos.
This is him right here. Yeah.
There you go. There he is. So some people feel that this could well be Elvis Presley having reinvented himself as this pastor from this small church in Arkansas. So a couple of problems here are that Elvis was quite a tall guy. And when you look at videos of Pastor Bob Joyce, he appears to be quite a bit shorter than Elvis. Also, Elvis was born in January 1935. So we've just passed what would have been his 90th birthday. And this guy, Pastor Bob, does not look 90 to me. Having said that, there are all kinds of things that can be achieved through Hollywood-style makeup and film props and things of that nature. And when you've got the intel communities on your side and they're helping you to cover up your true identity, then anything is possible. So this guy in his church sermons sings Elvis songs, and it's been commented on
almost identically like Elvis too. He sounds like Elvis.
Right. And people have said that he laughs in the same way as well. Elvis had this very distinctive laugh, and when Pastor Bob laughs, it seems just like Elvis. So personally, I can't rule it out. And if Elvis Presley was able to fake his death and fade off into the shadows with the assistance of intel, then how many other artists might have done this through the decades? Is that what we were looking at with Tupac, for example? Could that be what we were looking at with Jim Morrison, who I know you want to talk about? And how many other artists who we're told died at an untimely age could this dynamic also apply to? We have to consider the question, I feel.
Regardless if Bob Joyce is really Elvis or not, it's definitely brought him a lot of attention. He's definitely got his church recognized. I mean, he's blown up on TikTok. Some of those TikTok videos have millions and millions of views of people claiming. Now he's come out publicly and said that he's not Elvis, but I don't know how much weight that really holds. I mean, if you're actually trying to hide, of course you would say that you're not Elvis, right?
Well, he kind of has to. But you always find that they offer you symbolic clues, cryptic clues. So within Freemasonry, there's this dynamic known as masterful speaking, which is where you say two things at the same time. So there's a surface narrative that comes with plausible deniability. And that's what's put out there for the exoteric masses. So a good example of that comes from Paul McCartney, if it's really him. We can call him Billy Shears, if you like, William Shepherd, because there's this very strong opinion that the original biological Paul McCartney of the Beatles actually died in 1966. 11th of September is the date that most often comes up for this, 9/11/66. And that the public role of Paul McCartney has been getting played by an individual by the name of William Shepherd, known colloquially as Billy Shears, hence why on the Sgt. Pepper album we get the lyric early on, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears," because that was supposed to be the public's initiation to the new version of the Beatles with this guy in place of the original Paul. So over the years, this idea, this conspiracy theory, keeps bubbling to the surface every now and again. And every so often, Paul or Billy, whoever he is, gets asked about it. So in 2009, he went on the David Letterman chat show, and Letterman directly addressed all these silly, crazy rumors that Paul McCartney is really dead. And, Paul is laughing along with it, and he's saying, yeah, what happened was there was this sleeve to this record called Abbey Road, and I was walking across the zebra crossing barefoot. Because I was barefoot, everyone was looking at it and going, he's dead. And then Letterman has a good old laugh about it. And then he says, oh, of course, the other part of it is that you were replaced by this guy that, took the place of the original Paul. And McCartney or Billy, whoever it is, has a good old laugh. And he goes, yeah, well, I'm him. So right there, he's told you that he's the replacement. He's told you that he's not the original Paul, but it comes with plausible deniability. So the audience has a good old chuckle because they're like, oh, what a ridiculous idea. But he's told you. Now, if he's questioned and pinned down about it, he can say, oh, I was joking. Come on, you can't take me seriously, surely. But for those in the know, those who are initiated into occult systems and secret societies and learn how to spot symbolism and spot cryptic speech, he's told you something else. He's told you that he's not that original guy. So that's masterful speaking. And Masons learn how to do this, say two things at the same time, and they're seemingly contradictory. But the cover story, which is put out to the masses, is what they want most people to believe. So you have to learn to read the language of symbolism and code and cryptic ways of speaking to get to the bottom of what they're often telling you.
Neuro-linguistic programming at its finest. Yeah, our third movie was going to be about the Beatles. We were planning on doing, the first one was JFKX, about the JFK assassination, next one about The Shining, and then the third one was going to be about the Beatles, but it kind of fell apart and fell through. But we talk a lot about the music industry. Well, you talk a lot about the music industry in A Clockwork Shining. And there was a lot of things that you had said about Jim Morrison and the Doors and how his dad was a high up naval officer responsible for the Gulf of Tonkin false flag event, which led to the Vietnam War, which was responsible for hundreds and thousands of deaths. And it makes a lot of sense because Jim Morrison seemed like he could kind of do whatever he wanted to do because he knew that he was always going to kind of, get out of it because his dad was this high ranking naval officer. Now, you mentioned in the movie A Clockwork Shining that you believe that Jim Morrison had faked his death. Do you have any more information on that and what led you to that conclusion?
He ticks all the boxes for being the ideal candidate to have faked his death because of the family connections that he had, primarily who his dad was, very high ranking, as you just mentioned, the Navy Admiral. And 1 year prior to Jim breaking through as the frontman of the Doors, he appeared in a commercial in 1964 for Florida State University, which you can get on YouTube. So he's there in his college blazer, he's got closely cropped hair, and he's playing the role of a student from this Florida university. And he's very serious and very scholarly. And then 1 year later, he's grown out his hair. He's up there on stage with all these songs that have appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He's got all his bandmates with him, and all his bandmates in the Doors have high-ranking military fathers, all of them. Some of them, like Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek are more high-level connected than Jim himself, it would seem. So the Doors were effectively a military band. So by 1965, he's up there on stage. He's often drunk in performances. He's pushing drug culture. He's very much embodying the anti-establishment, countercultural, youthful spirit of the times. And the Doors were one of the bands that were used the most to push all that stuff forward. So the social engineers wanted to change the culture of the times, and it involved pitting the young people, the baby boomers, that was the generation that was in their crosshairs, against their parents' generation and value systems. So it's just more sowing discord in society and setting one group or one generation off against another. So it was sex, drugs, rock and roll, all kinds of other social changes and turmoil and unrest. There were all these activist groups going on, the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and all these activist groups. There was Gloria Steinem coming out with Ms. magazine and pushing the contraceptive birth control pill and trying to supposedly empower women by getting them to embrace feminism, the modern feminist movement. All these major social changes, not to mention Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and all this other stuff that was going on. So by the time you get to 1969, American society, and therefore by default world society, because everywhere else gets affected by it, was unrecognizable from what it had been at the start of that decade. Everything had changed. Attitudes to everything had changed. The Vietnam War was in full throttle. And as we've said, that was significantly accelerated by the role of Jim Morrison's father. And just everything in culture was different. Bands like the Doors had played a major role in shifting things in that direction. And by 1971, it seems that Jim Morrison's role was pretty much done because they got the social changes that they wanted. And a lot of the bands that had come out of Laurel Canyon, the Doors and all their contemporaries, weren't really needed anymore. There were new styles of music coming through, and that continued as the 1970s progressed, got into sort of punk and new wave by the latter part of the decade. And it seems that Jim's role, if we accept that he was an actor, and I do, he was literally an actor, just like Tupac, was no longer needed. So what do you do with somebody that comes from a military family when they're not required anymore and they're only 27, part of this mythical 27 club? The large number of musicians that have died at the age of 27 in some strange circumstance or other. Well, if you're high-level military grade connected like Jim was, you're going to know the right people to enable you to fade off into the background and fake your death. And that's what I believe happened. So the date we were given for his death was the 3rd of July, 1971. Interestingly, this was 2 years to the day after the founding member of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, himself died, 3rd of July 1969, when he was found floating face down in the swimming pool of his country cottage in southern England. So I personally feel that Brian Jones was taken out, and it was all to do with the other Rolling Stones wanting to take control of the group and steer it off in certain desired directions, and Brian was seen as getting in the way. He was expendable, past his sell-by date, and he went. Also, 3rd of July is when David Bowie retired his Ziggy Stardust character. Live on stage at Hammersmith Odeon in London, he announced that Ziggy Stardust was going to be retired off, which horrified all these diehard Bowie and Stardust fans. So there's something about the 3rd of July. It is the Feast of St. Thomas within sort of occult circles. And I wonder if that's why that particular date was chosen. So we're told that old Jimbo turned up dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment that he shared with his girlfriend, common law wife, Pamela Courson. So he was found unconscious in the bathtub, but there was no autopsy done on his body. And the only people to have seen his body prior to it being taken care of were Pamela, his partner, and one other guy, a medical guy. And it's reported that Jim had a smile etched onto his face, which is a pretty strange thing and a bit difficult to achieve for a dead body.
Yeah.
And the fact that there was no autopsy performed has got to raise some questions. So nobody can actually tell you what Jim Morrison died of, if you accept that he died. People have got this vague idea that it was some sort of overdose, but nobody really knows what the drug might have been. And we get this so often with rock star deaths. They're just chalked up as some sort of overdose or possibly, suicide, or nobody really worries too much about what it was that caused this person to pass away, because it's just chalked up as the rock and roll lifestyle. That's the way these people live fast, die young, all kinds of drugs and alcohol abuse and all this sort of stuff. I've often said, if the same amount of plumbers or lorry drivers turned up dead as rock stars do, people would be saying, what's going on? Why are all these plumbers and lorry drivers dying? What's happening, man? But when it comes to rock stars, they can just get away with it. So they achieved that with Jim, and he went into sort of mythical rock god status, like so many of these 27 Club members and, people like James Dean that have just entered into legend. And you've got all these diehard Doors fans that just feel Jim was this prophet and this poster child for the anti-war sort of countercultural generation. And a lot of people just don't seem to consider his military connections and what that might have enabled him to do. So his wife, Pamela Courson, died just a few years after him. And we also have the strange case of Jimi Hendrix, who died in September 1970. He was also 27 years of age. And there was this big spate at the time of all these artists that were passing away unexpectedly. Brian Jones, there was Jimi Hendrix in September 1970. The following month, October 70, Janis Joplin. Then in July 71, it was Jim Morrison. And they were all 27. And with Jimi Hendrix, there's so much evidence to demonstrate that he was murdered. He was taken out at the hands of his manager, a guy named Michael Jeffrey, who was actually a British military intelligence insider. That was actually his job. And for some reason, he crops up as Jimi Hendrix's manager. He managed some other groups as well, including the Animals out of Newcastle, who became one of the bands in Laurel Canyon when they relocated from England. So Jimi Hendrix, it seems, actually died through being waterboarded with red wine. This is what the coroner, who examined his body, because there was an autopsy there, said. He said that he was saturated in red wine. And when he pressed down on his chest, it was all coming up through his windpipe and stuff. So it seems that Michael Jeffrey had hired a couple of thugs from the Newcastle underworld to come down to London to do the job, to finish Jimi Hendrix off. We're told that it was to do with music publishing, the old adage that an artist is worth more to a corporation dead than alive. But there's a lady named Rachel Caruso who did a video a while back claiming that she comes from a multi-generational MKUltra satanic ritual abuse family, and that she had an uncle named Paul Caruso who was Jimi Hendrix's handler, mind control handler. And she repeats this idea that Hendrix was got rid of in this way. And she says it's because Jimi Hendrix was starting to break his mind control programming. So he also was an MKUltra slave, she says, from a multi-generational family on his mother's side. And when he was starting to regain some of his memories and his innate humanity was starting to bleed through the MK programming, it was decided that he was becoming too much of a liability. So that's why he had to go. That's her account for why he was got rid of. So I think Jimi Hendrix was a genuine offing, but Jim Morrison, I don't accept it was. because of all the unanswered questions that we have hanging over it, and mainly because of how high level connected he was, who his father was, the fact that he'd done acting jobs before. So it raises the tantalizing possibility that Jim could still be alive. If he is, he'll be 80 years of age, but it's not impossible. Stranger things have happened, it turns out.
80 isn't that old. 80 is not that old. He could possibly still be alive if he did indeed fake his death. And I think that this is interesting what you just said about the music industry. Like, they're worth more to them dead than they are alive, because then they no longer have to pay them for their money. So then they can just have, don't have to pay them for their music. So they can just keep all the money. It's kind of like what people have talked about with Prince. And the reason that they offed Prince is because Prince, I mean, this is a theory and speculation. The reason that they offed Prince was because he got the rights back to all of his music, and he wasn't distributing it to any of these platforms. He wasn't giving it, he took it all off of Spotify, he took it all off of Apple Music and all that. And 2 years after he got the rights back to all of his music, he was offed.
Right.
They don't want you to have the rights to your music, because if you have the royalties, and that's the same way with Michael Jackson as well. Michael Jackson had a huge catalog of music that he owned. He owned all of the Beatles,
Right.
like all of the, like, huge catalogs of music. So it makes sense that they would want to, get rid of these people, because then that opens up all the royalties and all the music that they have access to.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. When Whitney Houston turned up dead in a bathtub, and that was very strange as well in 2012, because 24 hours before Whitney was found dead in a bathtub, her daughter that she had with Bobby Brown, Bobby Christina, was also discovered unresponsive, unconscious in a bathtub in the same hotel suite, the LA Beverly Hilton. So this raises the possibility that Bobby Christina was the one that was supposed to be taken out, and for whatever reason, that didn't happen. So then 24 hours later, Whitney is discovered dead in the bathtub. And this was at the time when Clive Davis, who's a very suspect guy, music industry executive, he's been around forever. He was head of Arista Records. He put Puffy on the map, P. Diddy. So go figure. He's the guy that basically gave him his career and facilitated Bad Boy Records. But he was Whitney Houston's mentor. He's said to have discovered her and signed her to Arista. And at the time, Whitney was getting honored at a party for the Grammys, because the Grammys were taking place in LA at that time. And the news filtered through that Whitney had been discovered dead in the hotel suite above where they were having this party. And instead of stopping the party, which is what you might imagine would get done in the interest of good taste, Clive Davis decided to turn it into a celebration. So he said, no, we're not stopping the party. We'll just do it to honor Whitney. So the event is said to have taken on a sort of celebratory vibe. So when you get into the dark occult aspects of what goes on in the music industry and entertainment generally, you get into, things like rituals and the idea of sacrifices, the idea of artists being taken out, the idea of family members of artists being taken out as a condition of their fame and success and prominence and wealth. There's a heavy price to pay for being famous in these fields if you don't come from one of these important bloodline families. So it's possible that Whitney Houston was taken out in that manner to fulfill some kind of sick ritualistic agenda that these controllers adhere to. So where was I going with this? I was making a point about Whitney Houston. Yeah, she died in February, and this was just a couple of days before Valentine's Day. And when you think about the vast bulk of Whitney Houston's music, what it covers lyrically is love songs. So it was reported at the time in 2012 that her back catalogue, sales of her old albums, absolutely skyrocketed, went through the roof. All these fans were going out to buy these albums in tribute to her. And every Valentine's Day now, people are going to be flocking out buying Whitney Houston albums because it's love songs, right? So the timing is often important as to when these artists are taken out. And it is to do with music publishing in so many instances. You mentioned Prince and Michael Jackson, so many parallels between those two artists. You know, they were both doing battle with their respective record labels, Warner Brothers and the Sony Corporation. They both called them out as being completely immoral and exploiting artists and the terrible nature of the contracts that they were held in. And they were trying to regain control of their own music publishing, back catalogues, master tapes. Another artist that was embarking on that route was George Michael. So he did battle with Sony as well. He was signed to the same corporation as Michael Jackson. And it didn't end well for any of them. And there's all kinds of other strange stuff as well. Like Michael Jackson, we're told, died on the 25th of June, 2009, which is George Michael's birthday. George Michael died 6 months later to the day, on Christmas Day of 2016, 10 years to the day after James Brown. James Brown is also said to have attempted to extricate himself from his record deal way back in the 1960s, when he, Sam Cooke, and Otis Redding formed this sort of coalition where they were planning to launch their own record label for black soul artists and take back some of their power from the corporations that they were signed to, and, you know, win back their publishing and things of this nature. So straight away, Sam Cooke seemingly got taken out. We're told that he tried to rape a young woman at a motel after a show, and the woman escaped from his room and panicked and went to the motel reception, and the receptionist grabbed a gun and shot Sam Cooke as he tried to break into the office. That's what we're told. But as with all things, there's all sorts of anomalies and discrepancies and problems with the official story there. But either way, in December 1964, Sam Cooke was out of the picture. Then in 1967, also December, Otis Redding boarded a light aircraft after a show, and it crashed into a lake, killing everyone on board, including the group the Bar-Kays, soul group that were traveling with him. So there's Otis Redding gone. So that just left James Brown, and it seems that his fate for having dared to go up against his paymasters, his owners, was to be forced into loyal, obedient service to the control system for several decades to come. So for the next 40 years, he became known as the hardest working man in show business because of the amount of albums he put out, the amount of shows he did. Was that through personal choice, or was he being forced to do this because that was his payback? I suspect it was the latter. And then even when he did die, in his 70s on Christmas Day of 2016, there are, would you believe it, anomalies and discrepancies surrounding that event as well. Very strange stuff. So the 25th of June, when Michael Jackson died, is known within satanic groups as anti-Christmas. So whereas the rest of us celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December, because it's marking the sun having reached its lowest point in the solar year in its annual journey. So the winter solstice has occurred, 21st of December, and then the sun is seen to effectively stay still, which is what the word solstice means, for the following 3 days. And then on the morning of the 25th of December, it very slowly and very gradually begins to rise again. So it's God's sun, S-U-N, not S-O-N, rising after 3 days in the tomb, 3 days of being dead. Does that remind you of any stories you might have heard? So that's what Christmas is all about. It's the celebration, at least in the what's referred to as the Northern Hemisphere, of the days starting to get slowly longer as the sun moves towards its high point at the summer solstice. So Satanists who twist and invert everything celebrate the opposite. So on the 25th of June, 3 days after the summer solstice, the sun is gradually, very slowly declining a little every day. So it's symbolically being seen to die. And that's what Satanists love. They're all about death and decay, and symbolically, they like to represent this. So it's interesting that that's the date when Michael Jackson passed away. It's George Michael's birthday, and it's 6 months to the day before George Michael turns up dead. George Michael, a man arguably best known for the lyric, "Last Christmas I gave you my heart," turns up dead on Christmas Day of heart failure. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to.
That's a wild coincidence. Wild coincidence, Mark. There's a lot of information about Michael Jackson, and I think that Michael Jackson, there was this video that I watched, which I don't know if it's true or not, but someone analyzed the license plate number on the van that carried Michael Jackson's body out, and it shows him they're pulling into a. Have you seen this video where they're pulling into a parking garage and Michael Jackson gets out of the back of the van?
I think I've heard about it, but I've not seen the video.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And then later on, that same van with the same license plate is seen on the news, like picking up Michael Jackson's dead body.
It's just crazy, man. It's crazy. Every time you get a reported artist death, there's all kinds of things to just completely mess with your mind and tie researchers like me up in a knot and send us off down the garden path. You know, you have to be very thorough with your research not to get caught up in some kind of psyop in such cases, you know. So with David Bowie, for example, so 2016 was a really unlucky year in music history. So we're told that in January the 10th, David Bowie sadly passed away of cancer at the age of 69. At the very end of the year, Christmas Day, George Michael turns up dead in bed on Christmas Day. And you had the death of Prince in the middle, 21st of April 2016, we're told, at the age of 57 in an elevator at his Paisley Park complex just outside Minneapolis. So Bowie was a couple of days away from his birthday when he sadly passed away from cancer. This is an interesting thing because I've noticed a lot of celebrities, famous people that die seem to die 2 days before their birthday. I only noticed this today, but Jimmy Savile, I'm sure everyone knows all about Jimmy Savile and what he was up to, died 2 days shy of his 85th birthday in 2011. So he was born on Halloween, couldn't make that up, 31st of October, and he dies on the 29th. And I think, I've got to check this out, but David Lynch has just passed away, and I think he was 2 days shy of his birthday as well. So it's interesting how many of these famous people don't quite make that birthday by 2 days. But anyway, that's by the by. So David Bowie, we're told, dies in January 2016. So the morning after the news breaks, Sky News have this bulletin, and they wheel out this guy to pay tribute to the life of David Bowie. And they say that he's a music industry executive who goes by the name of Jack Stephen. Nobody had heard of Jack Stephen up to this point. When you went to do a background check on him at the time in 2016, as I and many others did, there was virtually nothing to be found of him online. Since then, I've discovered a few things. So he's got a LinkedIn profile. There's a mention of him in a Eurythmics book as having effectively discovered the Eurythmics or signed them to RCA Records. So he now seems to have a bit of a past, a bit of a history in the music game. But in 2016, nobody knew who he was. So he appears on this Sky News interview, and immediately people started remarking on how much he looked like David Bowie. And not only that, but he sounded just like him as well. The voice was uncannily similar, a bit like Pastor Bob Joyce and Elvis. So now you're left wondering, is this Bowie? Is he mocking us? Is he appearing one last time and then he's going to fade off into obscurity like Elvis possibly did? Or are we getting a bit too paranoid and a bit too conspiratorial? And has the guy really died and we're just reading too much into this? But then you look at the situation surrounding Michael Jackson. And the morning after we got the news of Michael Jackson in 2009, Larry King on CNN interviews this guy whose name is given as Dave. I think his real name is supposed to have been David Rothenberg.
The supposed burn victim.
Right. So the story is that when he was a kid, this guy was set on fire by his abusive father, and he suffered terrible burns, had to undergo surgery and such. And Michael Jackson befriended him in hospital. So when Michael died, Dave appeared to say what a wonderful guy he was and to share his memories of him and stuff like that. But again, people remarked at the time on how it looked as if it could be Michael Jackson under heavy prosthetic makeup, and how similar his voice was to Michael's. It sounded just like Michael. So it leaves guys like me unsure of exactly what's gone on and unable to say 100% one way or the other if these people are these departed stars under new disguises, or whether it's just coincidence or just the way things go. It's very difficult to pin down exactly what's gone on here. And I think they do it deliberately to confuse the likes of us.
Well, there's also this video that I most recently seen of Paul McCartney here, where the guy behind him looks more like he would probably look than he actually looks. It's so interesting here. This video of Paul McCartney, and right behind him, this guy is going to appear that looks more like Paul. Right there he is.
Well, it looks like friggin' John Lennon, doesn't it?
It does. Oh my God. Yeah, it does. Look at him.
Yeah. So people are saying, wow, that actually looks like John Lennon. It does look a bit like John Lennon.
Oh, I thought it was like the reincarnation of Paul McCartney, but it does look like John Lennon. Yeah.
Yeah. And when he turns to the side, he's got Lennon's nose, his kind of pointed nose. But there's all kinds of problems there as well, because we now have AI fakery, and you can't trust a video anymore because it could have been digitally manipulated and AI could have been put in there. You can't trust a picture that you find online anymore because it could have been photoshopped, because the fakery is now very good. So it's very difficult to be able to place any stock in any of this stuff. Really, you've got to go back to print photographs, which are much more difficult to fake, and old magazines and old books that have been around for decades if you want any reliable evidence in any of these cases. Most other things become grey areas because of the capacity for fakery. I mean, even something that troubles me greatly is I'm totally open to the idea that Paul McCartney was replaced and that the guy we have today might not be the original Paul McCartney. I can certainly say there's been more than one Paul McCartney. It's obvious from looking at photos and film footage and stuff. He changes in height, he changes in appearance, his face gets fatter and then longer and thinner. So it's two separate guys, or possibly more than two. But something that bothers me greatly is that I'm a big John Lennon fan. I love his solo music. I loved a lot of the stuff that he put out in the Beatles. I know that he was a very compromised character, a very complex character. And in many cases, he was not a particularly likable character. You know, he was very unkind to his first wife, Cynthia, and to his son, Julian, reportedly. And he used to mock disabled people and stuff. And these aren't great traits, you know. But at the same time, he put out some incredibly empowering music through his solo canon of work in the 1970s. And I personally believe that he was very sincere and very conscientious in a lot of the messages that he was putting out there. And you don't really find any other artist in music history that's put out that many profound songs in terms of spiritual, mystical stuff, which you've got in a lot of his songs, and also the more politically, socially conscious songs, and songs that just address complex topics and interesting subjects that other artists don't really go near. So for all those reasons, I really like John Lennon's work, and he's a totally fascinating character to study. But what bothers me is that when you look at the time of his final album, Double Fantasy, which was released just a few weeks before we're told he was shot outside the Dakota building in December 1980, he doesn't quite look the same as the John Lennon of old. He's changed in some ways.
But is
And
that because he kind of got out of the whole, music industry, and he was, sort of became a hippie as well? But could that have been because he didn't have all the people around him? He didn't have the makeup going on, so he aged more, so he looked different. Because I think that that's a contention with a lot of this stuff too. Because some people are like, "Oh, the celebrities look completely different." I'm like, well, if you're kind of out of the spotlight, you're not getting all the work done that you would normally be getting done. You wouldn't be made to look like you're younger than what you are. Like, I guarantee if Tom Cruise didn't have as much work done on him, if Brad Pitt didn't have all that work done on him, they would look like their age that they're supposed to be.
right. Yeah, well, I take that point, but it was more in facial structure and facial features that I started to see some problems. But the thing with John Lennon and all the Beatles is just how much they did change their appearance. And not only that, but they appeared to be two separate groups. They had two very distinct phases. So when they first emerged with their debut single, 1962, Love Me Do, they just finalized their original lineup, or the lineup that people are familiar with. So Stuart Sutcliffe was the original bassist, and he died at the ripe old age of 21 of a brain aneurysm right before the Beatles broke through to prominence in 1962. And Pete Best, whose mother, Mona Best, got the Beatles their very earliest gigs in Liverpool. She came from a military family background, would you believe? Her son Pete was the original drummer in the Beatles. And Mona Best, Pete's mother, got impregnated by a close friend of the Beatles, a guy by the name of Neil Aspinall. So he was a young guy. He was the same age as the Beatles, but he got Pete Best's mother knocked up, and she ended up giving birth to a son who was named Rogue Best, Vincent, or Rogue Best. And instead of getting rid of Neil Aspinall, who was a sort of roadie and an assistant and a close confidant of the Beatles, you might think this would be a very embarrassing affair and they'd want to get rid of Neil, to deflect attention away from what had happened. But no, they didn't do that. They kicked Pete Best out of the group and they replaced him with Ringo. So Ringo became the drummer with the Beatles, and he's the one that went on to the fame and the fortune and the great wealth. Whereas Pete remained in Liverpool and has just opened up the Casbah Coffee Club, which is where the Beatles did their first gigs in the city, as an Airbnb, because it's been his home for several decades. So the Beatles came out with this lineup, and to start with, they were doing these songs that endeared them to a certain demographic. So girls loved them, but they were also family friendly. So it's She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, From Me to You, songs like this. And there were songs that your mother would like and your granny would like because they were inoffensive. They did the Ed Sullivan thing in New York in February 64 and, endeared themselves to American audiences. But then 1966 comes along, and this is the beginnings of the counterculture. This is the beginnings of the flower power sort of hippie era and all these big social changes. And by the following year, which was known as the Summer of Love, 1967, they released the Sgt. Pepper album, which is very trippy and very psychedelic in parts. And they look like a completely different band. So those who adhere to the theory that Paul McCartney was replaced will say that by the time of Sgt. Pepper, they've switched out Paul for Billy Shears. So you're looking at a different guy. But they've all changed appearance. So on the cover of that album, they got longer hair, they're wearing moustaches, and then over the ensuing years, sometimes they got beards, sometimes they haven't. Sometimes they're wearing moustaches, sometimes they're not. John Lennon's got his little granny glasses sometimes, and sometimes he hasn't. Sometimes he's got long hair, and then he gets his hair cropped off. So they're looking different all the time. And I wonder if this was done deliberately to throw people off the scent if certain members have been getting replaced, because it can just be explained away as, oh, the Beatles were just going with the fashion of the times. And, of course they look different from album to album because everybody did in those times. There's a theory that the Beatles were the product of British military intelligence. Military intelligence is, of course, an oxymoron. But MI5 and MI6 are very closely linked to the Tavistock Institute, which is a social engineering think tank where psychological operations are dreamt up by social scientists, behavioral scientists, psychologists, those who want to change culture and change societal attitudes to all kinds of things. So they weaponize popular culture to get the job done. So they do it through things like movies, TV shows, and of course, music groups. So there was this guy named John Coleman, Dr. Jonathan Coleman, who was a British military intelligence guy. And he broke ranks and became something of a whistleblower. And he put out a book, which was published in 1991, titled The Committee of 300, Conspirators' Hierarchy. And this is a very sort of key book within conspiracy circles. He breaks down the 13 so-called Illuminati families, and he talks about secret society networks and the way they're all structured. But he makes a very bold claim in that book that the Beatles, and not just the Beatles, but also the Rolling Stones, who were supposed to be the Beatles' rivals, but supposedly came out of the same camp, were the product of Tavistock. And they were made as popular and as influential as they became, because you don't get those levels of fame and influence under your own steam. You have to be selected for it. There's no way a group could get even a fraction of the way towards the influence that the Beatles had over so many people if they didn't have the backing of the state, the military industrial complex, the true controllers of organized society. So, of course, the Beatles have to have been chosen, handpicked to be that group. And so that's apparently what they were doing. They were changing societal attitudes by sweeping their fan base along with them. So they started out as this group putting out these love songs, boy meets girl love songs. And then by the latter part of their career, they've embraced psychedelic, acid culture, and all the changes that were coming out of California in those times were being echoed in the London underground, the sort of counterculture that was happening in London at the time, with the Beatles spearheading the whole thing. So, it's interesting, isn't it? Because LSD appeared everywhere at the same time in Britain and America. And yet we're supposed to believe it's just this organic thing. It's just the way these cycles of culture go. And acts in America, bands were getting all psychedelic and experimenting with these new trippy sort of sounds at exactly the same time as groups like the Beatles and Pink Floyd and the Who were over here in Britain. It all smacks of being orchestrated social engineering, dreamt up, cooked up at Tavistock, because that's where they all come out of. And with groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Doors, the Mamas and the Papas, Frank Zappa, the Mothers of Invention, Joni Mitchell, all these other groups, the Beach Boys, the Monkees, Alice Cooper, all these bands that were coming out of Laurel Canyon, being used as assets to get the culture of the time changed. And I think it's fairly safe to say and fairly accurate to say that the ripples from what went on in the 1960s at the hands of these kinds of groups and those that control them are still being felt in society today. So a favorite thing that my dad used to say to me, there'd be this kind of situation where when I was younger, we'd be watching a movie together. I'd be like a teenager and a sex scene would come on. And there's nothing more awkward than watching a sex scene in a movie with your parents in the room. You start to shuffle awkwardly in your seat, And my dad would usually break the silence by saying, "I blame the 60s for this." And he had a point, because that's when it all began, sex coming into films and depictions of violence. It all happened at that time. In 1969, 20th of March, right at the time of the spring equinox, there was a guy named Dr. Richard Day, and he held a meeting which was connected to Planned Parenthood. So this is the eugenics operation that Bill Gates's father was a founder member of, all about population reduction. What could possibly go wrong, right? And Richard Day addressed a group of pediatricians as part of Planned Parenthood. And he outlined all the changes that were scheduled to take place in society in the decades ahead. And he told the people in the audience, David Icke tells this story often, but it's come up in my research as well. He told all the attendees to not take notes and to turn off their recording tape recorders. And one doctor there, for whatever reason, did take notes. And years later, just before he passed away, he published what he could remember of that meeting in 1969. And he said, Richard Day told everyone that music was going to get worse. Music was going to be used deliberately to drive a wedge between young people and their parents' generation. They were going to degrade moral values. They were going to deliberately and systematically work with Hollywood and the television industry to get graphic depictions of sex and violence into movies and TV shows that would be seen by a mainstream audience. And it was a slow drip, subversive attack through popular culture on not just America, but the rest of the world. And I think we can conclude that they've done a brilliant job of it.
Seems to be super successful. I mean, if you just look at the types of music that people listen to nowadays, dude, it's like completely garbage. It's one I can't even listen to it.
No, me neither.
I can't even, like, makes my ears bleed, dude.
Literally that. If I'm ever in a shop where they start playing what passes for hip hop now with all this auto tune, you know, I just have to get out of that shop because it makes me feel almost physically unwell. It has that effect on me.
There's also been this weird transition from bands and musicians into, I think it happened in the like early 90s, like as we were coming out of the 80s into the 90s, we started getting away from bands. Like it started becoming about the solo artist, like the solo person, and they started trying to rip people away from bands, like the singers of bands, and having them go out on their own. And like Fleetwood Mac, like a lot of these, they would try and influence them to try and break away from the band. And the only thing that I can think of is, you know, it's difficult to control 5 or more people, because sometimes, you know, with bands, there's a lot of people inside of the band. It's much easier to control one person than it is to control multiple people and get them all on the same page. So they started putting an emphasis on solo artists now. And now that's all popular mainstream music is. It's no longer bands anymore. It's now solo artists. But I think bands are starting to kind of make a tiny bit of a comeback.
Another thing is that you get all these artists collaborating with each other now. And I'm thinking of the genre that's described as urban. It's nothing of the sort, you know, but so-called hip hop and so-called R&B. So you have like the first artist name, and then you have a bunch of others separated by commas. And I know this, unfortunately, because my daughter listens to a lot of this stuff and I see all the names coming up on the screen. But it's like 4 or 5 different artists featured on the same track. And it's just a way of getting all these artists out there to these different fan bases and stuff. But it all sounds the same. They all sound exactly the same. It's the same producers they're working with. Everything's drenched in auto-tune. They all sound like gibbering robots. And we've been talking here about artists like Elvis Presley. You know, Elvis Presley broke out nearly 70 years ago. The Beatles had their heyday 60 years ago. And here we are still talking about them. Why? Because they're fascinating. Because their music was good, because their songs stood up to scrutiny and analysis, and they're still interesting to consider all these decades on. Who honestly believes that, never mind 60 years from now, let's say 6 years from now, there's going to be people sitting around going, I miss Cardi B. Cardi B was great. She had some amazing songs. The lyrical complexity and the themes that she was discussing, and you know, she was amazing, man. Who's going to be saying, oh, Doja Cat was just the best artist, you know? Even Ed Sheeran.
incredible lyricist. The lyrics are just so stunning. Megan Thee Stallion. Oh my God, Megan Thee Stallion. Whew.
Yeah, Migos. Oh, so good, so good. It's not going to happen, is it?
No, I don't think so. And that's the issue is because there's no soul. It's like all. I think a lot of it's just AI generated music now. I think that they've had this AI generated stuff for a really long time, and they've been using it in the music industry since the freaking early 2000s. And we're
Yeah,
just now getting it now. So it doesn't have any of that soul. It doesn't have any of that grasp. And that's the thing about the Beatles too, is the Beatles had, I think that they were the first and one of the only bands that wrote a lot of their music in the 234 hertz music.
a
So it's the
432.
432, sorry. 432, yeah.
Yeah, that's a thing that comes up a lot in my research. Frequencies, the tuning pitch, the standard tuning pitch where the A note is tuned to a certain number of cycles per second measured in hertz. So 432 is said to be a harmonic frequency. And you speak to so many musicologists, musicians, audiophiles, and they'll say, yes, 432 is the one because it's in tune with the rhythms of the body and the natural resonance of the earth. And it's just a highly natural choice to tune your music to. And music sounds much more pleasing on an unseen level. So you don't really notice it, but it has a very positive effect on the listener. Whereas 440 hertz, only 8 hertz apart, but making all the difference, is said to be a very discordant, very dissonant frequency. And that's the one that's been used as the international tuning pitch since the tail end of the Second World War, so several decades. So most pieces of recorded music coming through the corporations will have been pitched to 440. And a lot of the live music that you listen to as well, unless the musicians specifically know to retune their instruments to 432, is going to be getting delivered in 440. And this is said to put you in a state of unease and you feel very agitated and stressed, but you don't know why. So it's having that effect on you, but you're not consciously aware of it.
Yeah,
So
it's hitting you at a spiritual level, like a
yeah,
100% spiritual level.
yeah. And sound frequencies can do that. So when you get very low on the scale, when you start getting down to about 7 hertz, so the Schumann resonance, which is supposed to be the natural frequency of the earth, is said to be 7.83 hertz. But when you get even lower than that and you get down to about 7, you start to be able to actually feel sound frequencies. So you don't hear them, you feel them in your body. And there's technology available whereby very low frequencies are used to disperse crowds in like riot situations. So they unleash one of these sound weapons, and the frequency makes people feel physically sick. And there's been instances of people actually vomiting and actually losing control of their bowels because it's just pulsating through their body and having a horrific effect on them.
I think the
So that's
military has some of those that they say that they use for like riot control.
exactly. That's what
Yep.
they say they're used for, but we don't know when these things could be getting used against us. And it's just a reminder of how powerful sound frequencies can be because it's all happening on that unseen level. And now that we've got music or so-called music being delivered in digital electronic formats, the scope is there for all kinds of harmful stuff to be getting stripped into the recordings without anyone knowing they're there. So that's it. You know, kids now are listening to MP3s on their phones, and that's their idea of what music is. In our day, it was vinyl albums. You come home from the record shop with a great new vinyl album with this lavish artwork in the sleeve, and you get really excited as you put it on the turntable. It's all analog, and vinyl enthusiasts speak of that warm sound that vinyl used to deliver because you're getting a full frequency range recording. Now you've got all kinds of stuff getting stripped out of the recording when it's being compressed down to MP3. So a lot of the data is getting lost to reduce the file size. But if information and sound is getting lost and nobody notices, then the opposite thing could be happening, which is stuff could be getting stripped in and nobody notices. So you don't really know what you're listening to anymore because it's all digital and electronic. And I'm just not a fan. I'm not a fan of everything in society being digital and electronic. I'm not a fan of the fact that I've got a 2012 Apple MacBook right here, which has USB ports in. But if I want to get an updated Apple MacBook, I'm not going to have USB ports. So I'm not going to be able to plug devices in. Everything's got to be done wirelessly. I've got a car with a CD player in. Imagine that. Because I like driving around listening to CDs. But when I want to buy a new car, I'm really going to struggle to find a car with a CD player in.
I'm not
Because
going to find it.
they want you connecting your phone via Bluetooth and having all these EMFs, all this radiation swimming around. That's the way they're trying to take everything.
But that's
So,
convenience,
good work.
Mark. That's way more convenient than using cables and getting out your CD and putting your CD into the CD player.
Well,
I
I'm
miss
someone
those
that doesn't
times.
mind fiddling around with CDs. I don't mind that.
I miss those days though, when you would have the giant booklet of CDs in your car, and you're trying to find the right CD while you're driving. Like it's good old. Those are the good old days.
Oh, some of us
And
still did that. Huh?
I remember back in the day, you had a fancy car if you had a 6-disc CD player. You know what I mean? Like where you could have like 6 discs in there at the same time, and you could pick whatever disc that you want to listen to. You were like, you had a lot of money if you had one of those 6-disc CD changers in your car.
I used to feel great for having a cassette player in my first car in the late 80s. And, you know,
those were nice because then you could get that cassette player that had the aux cord into it, and then you can plug your phone, your iPod into the aux cable, and then play it through the cassette.
Well, it was Walkmans back in my day, but yeah, they were the iPod of the time.
So when it comes to like MKUltra, and we've touched a little bit on MKUltra here, and I've kind of been looking into the Jim Jones stuff as like and what's interesting is that in The Shining, there's this Kool-Aid that's above the fridge that we talk about in A Clockwork Shining, and you can watch that on Vimeo now worldwide. And the Jim Jones thing happened while this was being filmed, while The Shining was being filmed. And I've been kind of doing a little bit of research into the whole Jim Jones thing. And it seems like he had like a lot of military connections. He had a lot of intelligence connections, and that the entire Jim Jones incident is kind of shaping up to be a gigantic MKUltra experiment.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the Jim Jones story, but yeah, it certainly ticks all the boxes for having been a mind control cult. And many of these serial killers also seem to come out of that world as well. So Dave McGowan, before he wrote his book on Laurel Canyon, had a book called Program to Kill. And he's talking about all these well-known serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, Son of Sam, the Boston Strangler. And he's saying that many of these may well have come out of MKUltra labs. And it was an experiment, a very gruesome experiment. But, you know, these aren't particularly morally sound people that we're speaking of here, who just wanted to see what would happen if you would program a guy to become a killer and to go out there and just murder people. You know, how far could they take it? Would they break their programming? Just a massive social experiment. And I think that's what was going on with a lot of these cases. Something I'd actually missed, speaking of A Clockwork Shining there, until you and Jay pointed it out to me, was I was very familiar with the John Lennon assassination. I was very familiar with the John Hinckley attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, but I'd missed the timing. I'd missed the fact that The Shining was released at Halloween 1980, and it's got The Catcher in the Rye in it. You got Wendy reading the copy there. And right after that movie was released, 2 months later, or less than 2 months, John Lennon is assassinated, supposedly by Mark Chapman. He's reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye at the scene. And then a few weeks on from that, early 1981, John Hinckley tries to take out Ronald Reagan. He's reading a copy of Catcher in the Rye. And all of these events are just a few weeks after The Shining got released. So it really does add some weight to the suggestion that this movie was all about revealing secrets of MKUltra, and then it went real world. It became live exercises very soon after the movie was released. The timing is very intriguing in that regard.
Yeah, how could Kubrick have known about this book and put it inside of his movie, and then less than a year later, two major assassinations happen with the Catcher in the Rye on the scene?
Right. And
Wild.
that movie was begun in 1978. So it took a long while to film. You know, Stanley took his time with it. So does that mean that in 1978 it was known that they were going to take John Lennon out in 1980? Or was the decision taken along the way? I mean, we'll never know, but these are intriguing possibilities.
It really is. And there was a lot of things that was kind of, cut out of A Clockwork Shining just because it was getting really long. And it's super rough just making a movie in general, but making a movie that's almost 2 hours long, oh man, that can be a nightmare because it's just me, right? I'm putting everything together. And how many times you have to watch the movie to make sure all the details and everything is perfect, the music levels and everything it's over and over again. You got to watch that thing.
And like about 25 trailers as well.
Yeah. And shoot, it could drive someone literally insane. And I felt like Jack at the Overlook Hotel as I was making it. And I'm sure my girlfriend definitely felt the exact same way. But something that we left on the chopping block was the connections between Sidney Gottlieb and Allman's assistant, Bill Watson, which we talked about on your show around a month ago. And we also had a lot more on Charlie Manson in there, but it didn't really fit in anywhere. And you just mentioned Dave McGowan's book in there, Program to Kill. Both you and Jay both mentioned the book within the movie A Clockwork Shining. And while you were being interviewed for your part in the documentary, and it didn't make it to the actual final cut of the movie, but you mentioned that you believe that the Manson Tate murders were essentially staged in order to end the entire hippie movement. Would that be correct in saying?
Yeah, I do lean towards that being the case. And I've taken my cue for that largely from a paper that was put out by Miles Mathis, Miles W. Mathis. So this guy is quite enigmatic. Nobody seems to have seen him. There's no photographs of him or film footage, but he's got a website called mileswmathis.com. And he's a painter, not a painter and decorator, but a portrait painter, you know. And as a sideline, he's a researcher and he looks into conspiracies and psyops and assassinations and casts his watchful eye over them. And what he says is that being an artist, he's got a very keen eye for detail. So he spots things that other people miss, clues. And he's written so many papers. It leads people to suspect whether it's possible for one individual to have written this amount of material, especially if it's in his spare time, because it's a lot. And being an author, I know how long it takes to research stuff and write it and present it. But either way, there's a whole load of papers on his site. And I certainly don't agree with everything that he claims. So he claims, for instance, that the John Lennon assassination wasn't real, that it was faked. I don't agree with that. He says the JFK assassination was faked with JFK complicit in it. Don't agree with that either. But in his paper on Tate Manson, he presents what I consider to be a very compelling argument for that whole event having been a setup, a psyop, military grade. It ties into Laurel Canyon because you've got Lookout Mountain Air Force Base right up there in the canyon. And we mentioned that in the documentary as well. And it figures heavily in Dave McGowan's story about all the rock bands that were coming out of Laurel Canyon. But it turns out that right across from Laurel Canyon, as you go across the valley there, you have the house at Cielo Drive, which is where Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate lived and where the murders are said to have taken place. So there's a clear view from the house to the Air Force Base right across. And Miles Mathis contends that the whole operation could have been run out of Lookout Mountain. That makes a lot of sense. It would have been coordinated from there. And Lookout Mountain closed in 1969, ceased operations, right around the time of the Tate Manson event. So in his article, he's got a bunch of photographs, and there's all sorts of oddities, such as Sharon Tate, who's supposed to be dead by this point, supposed to be her body, is smiling. And this is a photograph that was put out into the mainstream. So again, it's almost like they want to see who's going to notice, and they're kind of mocking people by
Didn't
putting
you
it
just
out
say that Jim Morrison was also reported to be smiling?
there. Yeah, there's no photographs of him, but reports were that he was found with a smile on his face. Yeah.
Mm.
And there's just all kinds of things that don't add up. He shows what's said to be the interior of the Cielo Drive house, and it doesn't match earlier photographs from the 1940s of the same house. The ceiling has dropped in height. And he also points out that there's all kinds of shabby rugs and some dirty old couch and stuff covered in blood. And this is supposed to be the home of a well-known millionaire film director, Roman Polanski, and his internationally known actress, glamorous wife. Would they live in a house with these crappy old, shabby old rugs everywhere? It looks as if this stuff's been brought in from a secondhand charity shop to dress a film set. They get a bunch of fake blood from Hollywood just down the road and throw it around everywhere, and then get a bunch of actors to pretend that they're dead and photograph them. And it just comes across as a very compelling argument, as far as I'm concerned, that the whole thing was a pretty shoddily executed attempt at convincing people that these horrific murders had taken place. And the object of it would have been to effectively put a final nail in the coffin of the hippie culture of the times, because they'd done their psyop. They'd done the whole sex and drugs and rock and roll thing. They'd implemented all these social changes that they wanted to. And by the end of the 1960s, they were ready to wind it all up and move on to whatever came next. So they wanted to present the idea to the American public that hippies were these dangerous, wild-eyed, maniacal, murderous, crazy people. And they were unpredictable. You couldn't trust them. And they were a threat to polite society. So they should not be tolerated anymore. So Charlie Manson was their guy. He was said to have masterminded the whole thing. He, you know, in photographs and footage of him, he looks crazy. He's got these crazy eyes. He's got the beard and the long hair. And that would have fulfilled a lot of people's archetypal image of what a hippie represented. And that's why I think the whole thing was done. It was to shut down a lot of opposition to the establishment that was coming from the sort of hippie community, because they wanted the Vietnam War to continue, and they wanted to just shut down any sort of opposition to what they had planned to do, any kind of effective opposition. So this was a really good way of using social engineering and culture creation to achieve that. Again, the weaponization of popular culture.
It's also really interesting, the connections between Roman Polanski, Stanley Kubrick, and Jack Nicholson as well in the movie Chinatown that he directed with Jack Nicholson.
Right, yeah. Well, there's all kinds of crazy synchronistic connections between the Beatles and Rosemary's Baby and Roman Polanski. I mean, the amount of connections, which I detailed in my last book, Musical Truth Volume 3, got a whole section on these, and I've done podcasts on them as well. It's just beyond the realms of human planning, to be honest. It feels to me as if you could not get a bunch of master chess players and precision military planners to sit around a table and say, and then we'll connect the Beatles in through this song, and then we'll connect Roman Polanski in through this meeting with Ringo Starr at the Cannes Film Festival in 1968. There are so many connections, it's just insane. Not least the fact that John Lennon was gunned down outside the Dakota building, and this is where Rosemary's Baby was set. This is the setting for the story, and the exterior shots of the Branford building were actually those of the Dakota. And then in the movie, a young woman falls to her death from one of the windows of the Dakota building, and right where she lands is a white Volkswagen Beetle car parked, which gets splattered with blood, and it's parked right about on the spot where John Lennon would get killed 13 years later. And also a white Volkswagen Beetle appears on the sleeve to the Beatles' Abbey Road album. And the photo to that album, the cover photo of the four Beatles walking across the zebra crossing, was taken on the day of the Tate Manson murders, 8th of August 1969, the very same date. And that's just a couple of examples. They just go on forever. So it's interesting that you've got the Jack Nicholson, Roman Polanski connection through Chinatown, as you say there. And there's all kinds of synchronistic connections like this, which occur all the time. And it just raises even bigger questions about the true nature of this reality and what kind of coding could be running to cause all these things to occur the way they do.
And also in The Shining, they're walking like the Beatles' Abbey Road album cover. Stephen King was inspired by the John Lennon song Instant Karma to name his book The Shining. You got the Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger stuff.
Wow.
And also, I don't have the slide in here, I don't think. Here's the slide of Beatles and Abbey Road and The Shining. That's pretty much lined up identically. But there's another one where the Beatles were in talks to play the Hobbits in the, I don't know where that slide is. I thought I had that slide in here. Must have dumped it somewhere. But they were in talks to play the Hobbits in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. That Stanley Kubrick was in talks with creating the movie.
I didn't even know that. I didn't know that about the characters mimicking the Beatles road crossing thing there. And I didn't know about Stephen King being inspired by Instant Karma, where he talks about we all shine on. Didn't know that. I just got goosebumps when you told me that, actually.
Yeah, there's so many Beatles connections, along with the actual Volkswagen Beetle that Kubrick changed from a red to a yellow Beetle, and then later on, when Halloran's going up to the hotel, there's a red Volkswagen Beetle that's crushed under a semi, which is a jab at Stephen King. To wrap up here, we talked a little bit about Bohemian Grove in the documentary, which is another thing that was kind of it was talked about a little bit, but it wasn't really brought to the forefront. Kathy O'Brien, which is in the documentary, which is a Monarch MKUltra mind control survivor, was
I'm interviewing her in 2 days, actually.
Oh, great. She was to be sacrificed at Bohemian Grove. And what connections have you found between Bohemian Grove and the music industry? Is there any connections there? Because Bohemian Grove is said to have been like this place where the elites kind of congregate and they kind of plan out all this stuff. But it's also been reported that literal sacrifices and rituals go down there.
Right. Well, the main connection comes from one of the members of the Grateful Dead, who were a group that were very big in the 60s at the time of the counterculture, coming out of Palo Alto, California. And on the surface, they appear to be just this sort of greased out rock band, bunch of stoners, But when you dig into the family members and some of their affiliations and connections and where they come out of, you start to find connections into Freemasonry and other secret societies. And then you've got an interview from a few years ago with Bob Weir, who's one of the founder members of the group. And he's on this panel on some sort of chat show. And one of the questions comes up, and it's, what can you tell us about your participation at Bohemian Grove? And Bob Weir looks all sort of awkward and doesn't quite know how to answer the question. And he goes, well, yeah, Bohemian Grove is just like this social occasion, really. It's just like this get together, like a supper club or whatever. And, some of us just get together and discuss things. And there's really nothing to it. And you can tell that he really wished the question hadn't been asked, because now he can't deny it because he doesn't know what sort of evidence somebody might present that he was in attendance there. So he's got to admit to it, but he laughs it all off as it's just a supper club and it's harmless. I was at Yale University in April last year. I came over to the East Coast of the States, And I did a talk in New Haven, Connecticut, exposing all this stuff that we're talking about now. But during the day, I got a tour of the Yale University campus by one of the students. And she made the mistake of asking the tourists if anyone had any questions. And I said, yes, I've got a question. What can you tell me about Skull and Bones, the secret society mystery school fraternity that operates out of Yale? And she answered the question in the same way that Bob Weir did about Bohemian Grove. She said, oh, it's a supper club, really. It's just a social occasion, just dinner, bit of chat. That's all it is. Not what I've heard. A bit more goes on there. But that's the way they just like to write these things off. So we know now that one of the most instrumental, influential bands in the 60s, Counterculture, has at least one member who attends Bohemian Grove. So what is a rock star, a rocker, if that's all he is, doing attending Bohemian Grove? If it's reserved for like presidents and business leaders and lord mayors and things of this nature. It just goes to show that you don't really know who these rock bands are. You don't really know who the members are. You don't know what families they might come out of. And that's why it becomes a very dangerous thing to place your trust in any of them, particularly when it comes to bands like the Grateful Dead, who have a very loyal fan base, won't have a word said against them. And it's like this with most bands, These people are literally gods to their fans, and they'll make all kinds of excuses for them. So you can say to somebody, oh, Bob Weir attends Bohemian Grove, a Grateful Dead fan, and they'll come up with all kinds of stuff to explain it away. Oh, he was joking. He was being ironic, all kinds of, because people just don't want to have to face up to it. Fans of the Grateful Dead refer to themselves as deadheads. They think it's a term of endearment. I would suggest it's a term of mockery, which was invented by the controllers to demean them. But they don't see it that way. So they'll say, yeah, I'm a deadhead, man. But they're actually getting satanically mocked to their faces, and they can't even see it.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on, brother. Really appreciate your time here this evening. Can you let people know where they can find you online? This is your time to plug your website, your books, where they can find your books, your channel, or anything that you would like people to know.
Sure. Well, the main one-stop shop for everything is djmarkdevlin.com. So if you go there, you get links to all my videos, my podcasts. There's links through to my books. My email address is on the site if anyone wants to drop me an email with any feedback. I've done 3 books in my Musical Truth series, which is exposing the true nature of the corporate music industry. Musical Truth volumes 1, 2, and 3. They're all on Amazon, but I also sell copies myself if people want to come to me direct. They're also on Barnes & Noble, so if anyone doesn't like Amazon, you can find them on Barnes & Noble. And I'm writing a 4th book in that series right now, which I want to get out on the spring equinox. So I've noticed that this is a time of year when the so-called elites like to pull many of their stunts. So if we think back to the COVID situation in 2020, it all kicked off around about the time of the spring equinox, and they like to pull their little cute psyops around this time of year because of the incoming energy that's connected with the spring equinox. So I thought to myself, well, if they do all their stuff on these dates, I'm going to put my book out on this date, and I'm going to try and dissipate some of this negative energy and turn it towards something constructive and positive. So that's why I'm aiming for 322, which is, March 22nd. It's a date which is connected with Skull and Bones, which we were just talking about, because 322 is said to be the number of the Brotherhood of Death. So I'm putting a different slant on it by putting my next book out then. And it's going to be entitled No One's Dad's a Plumber. And this is largely entitled by the Jim Morrison situation. His dad was the Navy admiral, and we find countless examples of generals and lieutenant colonels and mayors and presidents and stuff, but you don't find many plumbers. You don't find many rock stars' dads who were plumbers. So that's why I've titled it that. It's just an ironic, funny sort of title for the book.
That's a brilliant name. I love it. And I would love to have you back on whenever you release that book so we can get even more deep into the rabbit hole in that. And the links to Mark's information is in the description of this video. Please hit the thumbs up button to help the channel and the algorithm. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications, and check out A Clockwork Shining. If you're in the United States, you can find it on Amazon Prime and Apple TV Plus. And also, if you're in the UK, you can also get it on those platforms as well. But if you're not in those two countries, you can find it on Vimeo. It is pinned into the top of the chat and is also in the comments and in the description of this video. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it, all of you, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye bye. Mark, stay with me.